Hillary Clinton thinks she'll win at least 4 out of the 5. She thinks it'll stretch out to here. Now, a much bigger lead if you bring in the superdelegates. Gets Hillary Clinton way out here, even close to the finish line, right? You see that? Senator Sanders back here, unless he has a big night on Tuesday. But let's forget the superdelegates for a moment. Set them aside. If her pledged delegate lead is in the 290, 300 ballpark Wednesday morning, Senator Sanders would then have to win about 63% of the remaining pledged delegates to catch Clinton in that count. Now, that's an unlikely scenario. One of the things Senator Sanders doesn't like in New York, 4 of the 5 states voting Tuesday are so-called closed primaries. Only in Rhode Island can independents vote. Senator Sanders doesn't like that.
I don't mind losing, but 3 million people in New York State, 3 million people who registered as independents did not have the right to participate in the Democratic or Republican Party. That really is not democracy.
Not in Senator Sanders' view, democracy, but it is the Democratic Party. And the parties, as we've seen on the Republican side, with Donald Trump complaining about a rigged system and a crooked system, the parties make their own rules. And in this case, the closed primaries, not good news for Senator Sanders at a very tough time in the campaign.
Yeah, this is a tough moment for him. He is making a similar argument in different words to what Trump is saying, that this system is really disenfranchising a lot of American voters. And I think that there are merits to that. We do go through this every 4 years where parties sort of remember what their rules are. But the math is just incredibly difficult for Sanders. He's learning what Hillary Clinton learned in 2008, which is based on the way that Democrats run their primaries, once a candidate pulls out to a fairly good-sized lead, it's really difficult to catch up. And he is continuing to make the case that there is a pathway to him. His campaign manager is talking about flipping superdelegates, but there's no sign at this point that superdelegates are looking to move away from Hillary Clinton toward Bernie Sanders, and that's really his only option at this point.
And when she went through this, Dan, in 2007 and then in 2008, ultimately, I think most people in the party knew she was a lifelong Democrat, that as hard as it was, she was going to figure it out, that she was going to find a way to embrace then Senator Obama and to try to bring the party together. And she did that. And Obama was grateful enough to make her Secretary of State when he won the election. It's more of a question mark for Bernie Sanders because he was an independent before he became a Democrat. A lot of the Clinton people are suspicious or skeptical that he's ready to be a big D Democrat. And they also see this online stuff where supporters of both campaigns are in a little nasty world out in the social media and sometimes as surrogates at events. What is the calculation Wednesday morning for Bernie Sanders if she has a 290, 300 pledged delegate lead? And the math is, frankly, as hard as it is to understand for Sanders people, impossible.
I think there's 2 calculations. The first is, what kind of a campaign does he run between now and the end of the primaries? Everybody knows he's going to run through California and the District of Columbia on the last day of the primaries. But what does he say about her? How does he prosecute the case? 8 years ago, when she was in a similar position, she told her aides, I'm going to run to the end, but I don't want to do anything or say anything that would make it more difficult for Barack Obama to become president in November. That's a question for him. The second then is, what does he want at the convention? What does he want in terms of the platform? What does he want in terms of how the system will work going forward? Will there be rules changes? And then the third is, what does he do and say to his supporters to make it clear that he wants to win in November and have a Democrat in the White House?
So what is, if Senator Sanders, and you could tell he's starting to think about this, there's been a bit of a divide publicly in his campaign. Tad Divide, the campaign strategist, saying, let's see how we do on Tuesday, then we'll think about it. Jeff Weaver, the campaign manager, saying we're going full bore all the way to the end. It's up to the candidate in the end. But if Senator Sanders moderates his tone, if Senator Sanders starts thinking about what do I want in the platform, starts being a big D Democrat, what is the burden on Hillary Clinton to reach out to his people? A lot of whom, especially the younger ones, say never, never vote for Clinton.
I mean, there is some polling and evidence that shows that if Hillary Clinton is the nominee, that those Sanders supporters and that progressive wing of the Democratic Party will come over and support Hillary, especially if she's running against someone like Donald Trump. But yeah, there certainly is sort of an impetus on Hillary to reward him in some way, especially if he stops persecuting sort of the personal case against her, which is sort of the nightmare scenario for Democrats, right? Because they're worried that he's going to say something that Republicans can use against her in the fall. And we already even saw that happen with Donald Trump. Donald Trump the other day stood up at an event and he said, Bernie Sanders says that Hillary Clinton's not qualified to be president. Not me. Bernie. So now I'm going to say it. So I think if that stops, she's going to be very grateful and is going to need to find a way to reward him.
And one of the things we've seen so far is that a lot of the Hillary supporters who are party establishment types, Senate Democrats, have not really pushed Bernie to get out of the race because they don't want to alienate his legions of supporters. But at the same time, he has not really said a lot of things, sharply barbed attacks until that unqualified line. If he continues that line of attack, very aggressive line of attack, after a particularly bad day on Tuesday, and if he loses Pennsylvania in particular, that's going to be a problem for him from his colleagues who are going to come after him pretty hard. And how does he deal with that kind of pressure? I think he'll have to consider that going forward, given that, if he says something sharply worded against her, it's going to probably come back and bite him.
We talk about this every time there's a competitive primary. What will it take to bring the party back together? But there does seem to be something about this year in which you've got different kinds of an electorate. And I think we've reached the point in the Democratic race where it might be difficult. It might take time. By November, maybe they'll all be back on the same page. But I think it's going to be incumbent on both sides to work to make that happen.
And she has, for the most part, dialed back her criticism of him. She was tough in Connecticut this week, which, if you look at the demographics of the states up Tuesday, Rhode Island and Connecticut probably the toughest for Hillary Clinton. And she brought up the gun because of Sandy Hook and the like. She brought up his gun voting record there. But more and more, she's trying to focus on Donald Trump. Listen to Hillary Clinton here. We heard Ted Cruz earlier in the show saying when Donald Trump's campaign manager says it's an act or it's a performance, Ted Cruz says don't believe anything he says. Hillary Clinton's take is quite different. She says, oh, no. Don't let him now get away from what he says about the wall, what he says about Muslims, because he means it.
Trump keeps saying things like, well, I didn't really mean it. It was all part of my reality TV show. Running for president will be on your screen. Well, you know what? If we buy that, shame on us. He's already showed us what he believes, and he's already said what he wants to do, and he wants to go after every one of the rights we have.
To Ashley's point, Julie, a lot of Democrats think that if Trump is the nominee, he's the motivator for party unity. Even if you don't like Clinton, even if you think you were for Sanders and you're disappointed, that Trump is the motivator. But in the Clinton campaign, do they believe that's enough, or do they think that she has to do more than just saying, I want you to join me, to say something about campaign finance reform, to be more direct about political reforms and Wall Street reforms?
They definitely see Trump as a motivator, something that they could go to young voters and say, could you really stay at home and let Donald Trump be president? But they also know that they can't spend the entire summer and the entire fall campaign talking about Trump, responding to him, that there has to be some kind of proactive message from her, some kind of vision of what she would do. But how to do that, especially in this environment where Donald Trump is so skilled at controlling the narrative and being at the center of attention, is really an unanswered question. It's actually, I think, one of the biggest questions that they face going into the fall campaign, how she carves out space for her own message, but doesn't let his attacks on her go unanswered.